Guilt is a heavy, invisible weight that many carry silently. It traps us in a cycle of fear and hesitation, making us retreat into ourselves, like a crab hiding inside its shell, moving sideways to avoid facing what hurts. What if nature itself could teach us why we avoid confronting our past mistakes? This story will explore the deep connection between our minds and the instinctual behaviors of the animal world, revealing how guilt can both protect and imprison us. Guilt is one of the most complex and powerful emotions humans experience. It's more than just a passing feeling, it can become a heavy burden that weighs on the mind, twisting thoughts and actions. Paralyzing guilt, in particular, is that kind of guilt that doesn't just cause regret, it stops us in our tracks, locking us inside a mental cage. It's the difference between acknowledging a mistake and being trapped endlessly in self-blame, unable to move forward. In everyday life, this paralyzing guilt shows itself in subtle yet impactful ways. Imagine someone who keeps replaying a painful event over and over in their mind, unable to forgive themselves for what happened. This mental loop can lead to anxiety, sadness, and even physical symptoms like fatigue or insomnia. It's as if the mind gets stuck in a loop, unable to break free from the weight of what-ifs and should-haves. This kind of guilt often blocks personal growth, making the person feel isolated and hopeless. Take, for example, a person who made a serious mistake at work, maybe a missed deadline or a wrong decision. Instead of learning from the experience, they become consumed by guilt, avoiding their colleagues and procrastinating on new tasks out of fear of failing again. This avoidance behavior is a form of paralysis. The guilt doesn't help them fix the problem. It freezes them in place, worsening the situation. Another common place where paralyzing guilt manifests is in relationships. People who feel guilty over past mistakes, harsh words, broken promises, or neglected responsibilities, often find themselves withdrawing instead of addressing the issue. The fear of confrontation or rejection leads them to hide behind emotional walls, much like a crab retreating into its shell. This avoidance keeps wounds fresh and blocks healing, creating cycles of silence and misunderstanding. Paralyzing guilt also carries a strong internal narrative that fuels it. It whispers harsh judgments, magnifies flaws, and minimizes achievements. "You're not good enough, you always mess things up," or "you don't deserve forgiveness," are common thoughts that deepen the emotional trap. This mental self-sabotage can distort reality and reinforce the feeling that escape is impossible. Importantly, paralyzing guilt is different from healthy guilt, the kind that helps us recognize when we've done wrong and motivates positive change. Healthy guilt can inspire apologies, repair, and growth. But when guilt becomes paralyzing, it loses its function as a guide and becomes a prison. The challenge lies in recognizing when guilt stops being useful and starts harming our well-being. This state of emotional paralysis often leads to what psychologists call avoidance coping. Rather than confronting uncomfortable feelings or situations, individuals dodge them, hoping the pain will pass or disappear. Unfortunately, this avoidance usually intensifies the guilt, creating a vicious cycle that's hard to break. The feeling of being stuck in one's own mind can also lead to a loss of self-trust. When guilt dominates, individuals doubt their judgment, feel ashamed of their intentions, and hesitate to take new risks. This emotional paralysis can slow down life's progress, affecting careers, friendships, and personal happiness. Yet, despite how overwhelming paralyzing guilt can feel, it is a deeply human experience, one that millions share. It reveals how sensitive we are to our actions and their impact on others and ourselves. At its core, guilt is connected to our moral compass and desire for connection, even if it sometimes drives us to isolation. Understanding the state of paralyzing guilt is the first step toward breaking free. By recognizing the signs, the obsessive thoughts, the avoidance, the emotional withdrawal, we can begin to see that we are not trapped by fate but by patterns we can change. This awareness opens the door to healing and growth, even when it feels impossible. As we continue, we will explore a surprising source of insight into this emotional state, the natural world. Specifically, the crab. An animal whose very way of moving and protecting itself offers a powerful metaphor for how we navigate guilt. Just like the crab, our minds can get caught in sideways steps and shells that protect but also imprison us. This connection will help us see paralyzing guilt not just as a human flaw, but as part of a broader instinctual response, making the path toward understanding and change clearer than ever. When we think of a crab, the first image that often comes to mind is a small creature with a hard shell and sideways walk. But the crab is much more than that simple picture. It is a fascinating animal with behaviors deeply connected to survival, protection, and avoidance, making it a powerful metaphor for the emotional state of paralyzing guilt. Crabs belong to the crustacean family and are found all over the world, from ocean shores to freshwater rivers and even on land in tropical regions. Their sturdy exoskeleton acts like a natural armor, protecting their soft, vulnerable bodies from predators and harsh environments. This shell, while a lifesaver, also confines them, much like how guilt can trap a human mind inside emotional walls. One of the crab's most distinctive behaviors is its sideways movement. Unlike most animals that move forward to face challenges head-on, crabs prefer to move sideways, often appearing to avoid direct confrontation. This sideways walk isn't just a quirky trait, it's an instinctive way to navigate their environment more efficiently, allowing quick escapes and sidesteps from danger. This movement pattern mirrors how a person overwhelmed by guilt might avoid facing their problems directly, taking detours to sidestep emotional pain. Inside their shells, crabs are surprisingly vulnerable. Their exoskeleton can only protect so much before they need to shed it and grow a new one, a process called molting. During molting, crabs are exposed and defenseless, making it one of the riskiest times in their life. This vulnerability is symbolic of what happens when a person begins to confront guilt and emotional pain. Stepping out of their protective shell feels dangerous but is necessary for growth and healing. Crabs are also solitary by nature, often retreating to hidden places or burrowing into the sand to escape threats. This tendency to hide and isolate aligns closely with how paralyzing guilt makes people withdraw from social connections, fearing judgment or rejection. The crab's shell becomes a sanctuary but also a prison, much like the emotional walls built by guilt. Interestingly, some crab species exhibit social behaviors, forming groups or even sharing burrows. However, these social crabs are the exception rather than the rule. The majority prefer solitude and protection, highlighting the instinctual drive to avoid harm. This social isolation can be linked to how guilt often isolates individuals emotionally, even when they desperately need support. The crab's habitat is another important aspect to consider. Crabs live in dynamic, sometimes harsh environments. Tides rise and fall, predators roam, and food sources fluctuate. Their survival depends on constant vigilance and adaptability, but also on knowing when to retreat and hide. Similarly, humans navigating paralyzing guilt often live in emotional turmoil, trying to balance confrontation and avoidance, safety and growth. From an evolutionary standpoint, the crab's sideways movement and protective shell are brilliant adaptations that maximize survival chances. Yet, they come at a cost: limited mobility and vulnerability during molting. This duality perfectly captures the paradox of paralyzing guilt. It protects us by making us cautious but also limits our freedom and potential. The crab's physical features also tell a story. Its claws, for example, are tools for defense and interaction. They can grasp, pinch, and hold, symbolizing how guilt can grip a person tightly, holding them back from moving forward. But claws are also instruments for exploration and survival, hinting at the possibility of using our emotional experiences as tools for growth if we learn to manage them wisely. Moreover, the crab's eyes are set on stalks, allowing it to see in almost all directions without moving its body much. This heightened awareness reflects the hypervigilance often felt by someone trapped in guilt, always watching, anticipating danger, but hesitant to act or move forward directly. The imagery of the crab moving sideways, protected by a hard shell but vulnerable underneath, offers a vivid lens to understand paralyzing guilt. Just as the crab's instincts drive it to avoid danger through detours and protection, the human mind often resorts to avoidance and emotional withdrawal when overwhelmed by guilt. Through this detailed look at the crab's natural life, we see a creature shaped by millions of years of evolution to survive by moving cautiously, hiding when threatened, and protecting its vulnerable self with a strong shell. This makes the crab an ideal symbol for exploring the emotional patterns of paralyzing guilt, protective yet limiting, instinctive yet confining. As we move forward, this metaphor will guide us in understanding how our own instincts and emotions intertwine, helping us uncover the roots of avoidance and the steps needed to break free from the mental shell of guilt. The crab's sideways walk and protective shell offer more than just a natural curiosity, they mirror profound emotional patterns that humans experience, especially when trapped in paralyzing guilt. This connection between the crab's instincts and the human psyche reveals how deeply our survival mechanisms are intertwined with ancient biological responses. When guilt overwhelms a person, the mind instinctively seeks ways to protect itself, much like the crab retreats into its hard shell. This shell symbolizes emotional defenses, walls of avoidance, denial, and withdrawal. Just as the crab's shell shields it from external threats, these emotional walls guard the mind from the pain of confronting past mistakes and harsh self-judgments. However, this protection comes at a price. The crab's shell restricts its movement and interaction with the outside world, confining it within a limited space. Similarly, paralyzing guilt confines the individual within a mental prison, where forward progress feels impossible. The person feels stuck, unable to move forward emotionally, much like the crab moves sideways, avoiding direct confrontation. The sideways movement of the crab is a powerful metaphor for avoidance behavior. Instead of facing problems head-on, a person burdened by guilt sidesteps difficult conversations, delays decision-making, and evades self-reflection. These sideways steps aren't just fear-based reactions, they are instinctual strategies designed to minimize pain and potential harm, mirroring the crab's natural instinct to avoid predators by moving indirectly. This pattern of avoidance may feel safer momentarily, but it reinforces the very paralysis that guilt creates. Each sideways step around an issue is a missed opportunity to heal, to apologize, or to make amends. Over time, this creates a cycle of emotional stagnation, where the person remains trapped in the past, unable to embrace growth or change. Moreover, the crab's vulnerability during molting parallels the human emotional experience when one attempts to shed the shell of guilt. Just as the crab is exposed and defenseless while growing a new exoskeleton, a person must become vulnerable to heal. This vulnerability is terrifying because it means confronting shame, regret, and fear. Emotions that the protective shell tried to keep at bay. In this way, the crab's life cycle teaches us that healing requires courage to step out of the protective shell, despite the risks. It invites reflection on how the emotional walls we build can both save and imprison us, urging us to find a balance between protection and openness. Social isolation, another hallmark of paralyzing guilt, finds its echo in the crab's solitary habits. When guilt becomes overwhelming, people tend to withdraw, much like crabs retreating into hidden burrows. This isolation may feel like safety, but it also cuts off connection, understanding, and support, crucial elements for emotional recovery. The crab's claws symbolize the gripping nature of guilt. Just as claws can hold tightly onto objects, guilt clamps onto the mind, squeezing thoughts and feelings until they become suffocating. This grip creates tension and fear, making it difficult to loosen the hold and move forward. Yet, claws can also be tools, for defense, for exploration, for interaction. This duality reminds us that guilt, when understood, can be transformed from a paralyzing force into a motivator for change. Recognizing the claws of guilt is the first step to gently releasing their hold and using their energy constructively. The crab's eyes on stalks also provide a striking metaphor for the heightened vigilance caused by guilt. Those trapped in paralyzing guilt often feel as if they must constantly watch for judgment, from others and from themselves. This hyper-awareness can be exhausting, and it keeps the mind locked in a state of anxious alertness, unable to relax or let go. This constant looking out for threats or mistakes keeps the emotional system activated, much like a crab scanning its surroundings for predators. While it may feel necessary for survival, this state of tension prevents true peace and freedom. By drawing these parallels, we see that paralyzing guilt is not simply a psychological problem but a deeply rooted survival mechanism, shaped by instincts and emotional needs. The crab's natural behaviors. Moving sideways, retreating into a shell, wielding claws, and vigilant watching, embody how the human mind instinctively tries to protect itself from pain but ends up trapped by its own defenses. Understanding this connection offers empathy and insight. It shows that avoidance, withdrawal, and emotional paralysis are not failures of character but biological responses to overwhelming guilt. This knowledge can free us from self-blame and open pathways toward healing. In the next chapter, we will explore scientific explanations from psychology and biology that deepen this understanding, showing how these instincts are wired into both human and animal behavior. This scientific perspective will reinforce the metaphorical link and offer tools to break free from the shell. To fully grasp why paralyzing guilt traps the human mind much like a crab trapped within its shell, we must turn to both psychology and biology. These sciences reveal how deep-rooted instincts and emotional responses shape behaviors that seem irrational but are, in fact, survival strategies encoded over millennia. From a psychological perspective, guilt is a complex emotion involving self-awareness and moral judgment. It signals that a person believes they have violated their own standards or social expectations, triggering a cascade of internal conflict. This emotional turmoil activates parts of the brain linked to threat detection and self-preservation, such as the amygdala and prefrontal cortex. These areas regulate fear responses and decision-making, which explains why guilt often feels like a threat that must be defended against or avoided. The paralyzing aspect of guilt emerges when this threat response becomes overwhelming. Instead of motivating reparative action, excessive guilt can freeze the mind in a defensive posture. This is similar to the freeze response observed in animals when faced with danger. Neither fight nor flight seems possible, so the organism remains immobile, hoping to avoid detection or harm. Neuroscientific studies reveal that this freeze response is linked to the autonomic nervous system's sympathetic branch. When triggered by intense guilt, the body enters a state of hypervigilance while simultaneously shutting down proactive behaviors. Heart rate may increase, muscles tense, yet movement and decision-making are inhibited. This creates a paradoxical state of internal turmoil coupled with external paralysis. Much like the crab confined by its shell, unable to move forward directly. Biologically, the crab's sideways movement and retreat into its shell are evolutionary adaptations for survival. Crabs have evolved these behaviors to avoid predators efficiently while protecting their vulnerable bodies. Similarly, humans have developed emotional and cognitive shells to shield themselves from psychological threats, such as shame and guilt. These defensive mechanisms include denial, repression, and avoidance, which temporarily reduce emotional pain but risk long-term stagnation. Research in evolutionary psychology supports the idea that emotions serve adaptive purposes. Guilt, for example, promotes social cohesion by encouraging reparative actions and discouraging harmful behavior. However, when guilt becomes excessive or chronic, it loses its adaptive function and instead contributes to mental health challenges, such as anxiety, depression, and rumination. This shift explains why the protective shell of denial and avoidance, while initially helpful, can become a prison. Furthermore, studies on animal behavior highlight fascinating parallels. Crabs, like many other creatures, exhibit behavioral inhibition when stressed. A form of freezing or retreat that conserves energy and reduces risk. In humans, this inhibition can manifest as emotional shutdown or withdrawal when overwhelmed by guilt or shame. Both species share an instinctive response to perceived threat that favors safety over confrontation. This connection is further supported by the field of neuroethology, which studies how nervous systems generate natural behaviors. The neural circuits that govern fear, avoidance, and social bonding are conserved across many species, including humans and crustaceans. This biological continuity helps explain why the crab's physical behaviors so vividly reflect human emotional patterns related to guilt. Psychologists also examine how cognitive distortions sustain paralyzing guilt. People caught in this state often experience black and white thinking, catastrophizing, and personalization. Believing their mistakes define their entire being and fearing irreversible consequences. These thought patterns reinforce the emotional shell, much like the crab's exoskeleton that becomes a barrier to growth. Importantly, therapeutic approaches such as cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and mindfulness-based interventions target these distortions and the physiological freeze response. By increasing awareness and promoting acceptance, individuals can gradually lower their defensive walls, just as a crab must eventually molt its old shell to grow. Biologically, molting represents renewal and vulnerability. In humans, shedding the emotional shell of guilt requires facing pain and uncertainty, a difficult but necessary step toward healing. Neuroscience shows that this process involves neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize itself, enabling new emotional patterns and healthier coping strategies. In summary, science confirms that paralyzing guilt is not merely a moral failing or personal weakness. It is a powerful, evolutionarily ingrained survival response that, when out of balance, can trap individuals in a state of emotional immobility. The crab's behaviors of moving sideways, retreating into a shell, and freezing under threat offer a vivid, instinctual metaphor for this human experience. Understanding this biological and psychological foundation provides hope. It reveals that these patterns are natural but changeable, opening pathways for therapeutic interventions and personal growth. As we learn to recognize the signals of our emotional shell, we can begin the courageous work of stepping out, confronting guilt constructively, and embracing healing. The next chapter will explore real-life examples illustrating how this intricate dance between guilt and instinct plays out in everyday life, demonstrating both the challenges and the possibilities of breaking free from emotional paralysis. Every day, countless people grapple with the invisible weight of paralyzing guilt, trapped in emotional shells much like the crab's protective exoskeleton. These mini-stories reveal how this state manifests in subtle, yet deeply impactful ways, turning internal conflict into real-life paralysis. Take Sarah, a middle-aged woman who accidentally neglected her elderly mother's medical appointment. The moment she realized her mistake, a wave of guilt overwhelmed her. Instead of seeking help or apologizing, Sarah withdrew emotionally and physically, avoiding phone calls and visits. Her mind replayed the error endlessly, and the guilt's heaviness grew like a cage, freezing her ability to act. Like a crab retreating sideways into its shell, Sarah sidestepped direct confrontation with her feelings and the situation, preferring avoidance over resolution. This emotional paralysis prolonged her pain and strained family ties. Similarly, James, a young professional, made a critical error on a work project that affected his team. Rather than admitting the mistake and taking responsibility, James found himself stuck in self-blame. The fear of judgment and failure turned his guilt into a relentless storm. He started missing meetings and isolating himself, trapped in denial and fear. His behavior mirrored the crab's instinct to hide under the shell. A defense mechanism that temporarily shields but ultimately stunts growth. James's career and confidence suffered as he remained locked in this cycle. On the other hand, Maria, a college student, experienced guilt after a heated argument with a close friend. Instead of avoiding the conflict, Maria initially froze, unable to reach out or express her feelings. She felt trapped inside her shell, battling her own harsh inner critic. Yet, after days of reflection, Maria summoned the courage to break the paralysis and initiated a heartfelt conversation, repairing the friendship. Her story highlights that while the crab's shell can be confining, it also serves as a space for gathering strength before moving forward. In families, guilt often weaves complex patterns of silence and avoidance. Consider the case of Tom, a father who struggled with guilt after missing an important event for his children due to work commitments. Rather than discussing his feelings openly, Tom buried his guilt deep, creating emotional distance. His children sensed this withdrawal, leading to frustration and misunderstandings. The family dynamic became like a crab's sideways shuffle, no direct confrontation or resolution, just evasive maneuvers that left wounds unhealed. In the workplace, guilt-driven paralysis appears in subtle ways as well. Anna, a manager, felt guilty for missing deadlines that impacted her team's success. Instead of addressing the issue transparently, she avoided conversations and meetings, hoping the problem would resolve itself. This avoidance is a behavioral echo of the crab's sideways movement, not a direct escape, but a cautious detour that avoids the perceived threat. Her team's morale suffered, and so did Anna's sense of self-efficacy. These examples reveal how paralyzing guilt often traps people in a loop of avoidance and emotional withdrawal. The common thread is a fear of direct confrontation, of others, of mistakes, and most painfully, of oneself. This fear breeds a protective shell that limits growth and healing, much like the crab's exoskeleton shields its vulnerable body but also confines its movement. Yet, these stories also illuminate hope. They demonstrate that while the crab's shell can feel like a prison, it is also a place of potential transformation. The shell provides a necessary pause, a moment to gather strength and reassess before stepping forward. People like Maria show us that breaking out of guilt's paralysis is possible through courage and self-compassion. Understanding these patterns helps us recognize when we or others are caught in this emotional freeze. It invites empathy instead of judgment, and patience instead of pressure. Each example teaches us that healing begins when we acknowledge our feelings, confront them gently, and seek connection rather than isolation. In real life, these behavioral manifestations of guilt and avoidance can shape relationships, careers, and mental health. But recognizing the crab's pattern offers a roadmap out of the shell, encouraging us to face our emotions, take responsibility, and gradually reclaim movement in our lives. The next chapter will delve into the lessons and reflections that arise from this understanding, guiding us toward growth, forgiveness, and renewed emotional freedom. Understanding the deep connection between paralyzing guilt and the crab's protective shell offers profound insights into the human psyche. It invites us to step back and reflect on our own emotional responses, encouraging compassion, awareness, and a path toward healing. This final chapter focuses on what we can learn from this metaphor and how it can guide us toward emotional freedom. First, it's essential to recognize that guilt is not inherently harmful. As an evolutionary and social emotion, guilt signals when we have crossed our own moral boundaries or hurt others, prompting self-correction and growth. Like the crab's shell, it serves a protective function, guarding us from repeating mistakes and encouraging thoughtful reflection. However, the problem arises when guilt becomes excessive, overwhelming, and immobilizing, creating a prison rather than a safe haven. The crab's behavior teaches us that retreat and avoidance may feel like survival strategies but often lead to stagnation. Emotional shells, built to shield us from pain, can trap us in cycles of rumination and self-blame. We may sidestep confronting difficult truths, walking sideways around problems rather than facing them head-on. Yet, true growth demands the courage to shed this shell, to confront discomfort, take responsibility, and allow vulnerability. One key lesson is the importance of self-compassion. Too often, guilt is accompanied by harsh self-judgment, exacerbating emotional paralysis. By learning to treat ourselves with kindness, acknowledging that mistakes are part of being human, we begin to soften the grip of guilt. This shift opens space for healing rather than punishment, just as a crab must soften and shed its old shell to grow. Another vital insight is the power of mindfulness and emotional awareness. By becoming more attuned to our feelings and bodily responses, we can recognize when guilt is becoming overwhelming and triggering a freeze response. This awareness allows us to interrupt automatic patterns, to pause and choose healthier ways to respond. Therapies like mindfulness-based stress reduction teach us to observe emotions without judgment, gently releasing the need to avoid or suppress painful feelings. Reflection also reveals the social dimension of guilt. While it promotes accountability and connection, when unchecked, it can isolate us. Sharing our burdens with trusted others, whether friends, family, or professionals, breaks the isolation of the shell. Vulnerability in community fosters empathy and support, providing the strength needed to move forward. The metaphor of the crab's shell also encourages patience. Emotional growth is rarely linear or swift. Just as crabs molt gradually, shedding their shells in stages, we too must allow ourselves time to process and heal. Pushing too hard too fast risks damage, gentle persistence builds resilience. Most importantly, this reflection calls us to embrace imperfection and the messy realities of human emotion. Paralyzing guilt, while painful, is part of a larger story of learning, connection, and transformation. It reminds us that emotional paralysis is not a sign of weakness, but a natural response that can be overcome with awareness, courage, and support. By understanding these lessons, we empower ourselves to break free from the sideways shuffle of avoidance and the confinement of our emotional shells. We begin to move forward with intention, facing challenges directly and growing stronger through them. As this journey closes, remember that guilt need not be a cage but a signal. A call to deeper self-understanding and renewed relationships. Let this metaphor inspire you to step out of your shell, not in haste or fear, but with hope, self-love, and the courage to embrace all parts of your human experience. What will your next step be? Will you continue to retreat, or will you find the strength to move forward, shedding the weight of paralyzing guilt and living freely?